Hello and welcome, everybody. We are pleased to bring you another free 90-minute webinar today from Desert Waters Correctional Outreach entitled Sleep Matters, What Science Tells Us. I am Justin Stevens, Desert Waters Chief Operating Officer and Master Instructor. Desert Waters is a nonprofit established in Colorado 22 years ago. Our mission is to improve the well-being of corrections and other public safety professionals through training, consulting, and other essential resources to foster resilience, mental health, and overall wellness in these challenging professions. Please visit us at desertwaters.com and follow us on LinkedIn and Facebook. Today's presenters are Katerina Spinaris, Desert Waters founding director, and Gregory Morton, Desert Waters research advisor. Katerina Spinaris, PhD, is Desert Waters founding director, a research psychologist, a licensed professional counselor. She develops wellness curriculum for correctional staff and conducts research in ways to lessen corrections fatigue and increase corrections fulfillment at both the individual and the organizational levels. Katerina has helped design Desert Waters Staff Wellness Accreditation Program, Safety Net Accreditation, and Desert Waters Safe Haven Wellness Program that consults with agencies to build their staff wellness programs in data-driven and holistic ways. Also, we have with us Gregory Morton. He is Desert Waters research advisor. He worked for a state correction system for over 30 years, retiring as administrator for staff training and professional development. He holds a master's degree in industrial and organizational psychology, concentrating on work-related stress and trauma and their impact on first responders. Greg has contributed significantly to the design of Desert Waters Staff Wellness Accreditation Program, Safety Net Accreditation. Before we dive into this important presentation, I'd like to invite you to post questions in the chat. At the end of the presentation, Greg and Katerina will answer as many questions as we can. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Katerina Spinaris.
So maybe we should start with welcoming again, everybody. This topic is something we don't talk about very much, but it's of extreme importance. And normally we have done webinars as a discussion going over a number of questions. For this one, we put together a PowerPoint because there is so much information and so many pieces of data that we want to convey to you to show the importance of sleep and its health impacts. So we're going to be going through a formal PowerPoint presentation and also taking questions. And we also want to acknowledge right up front that this is a very complex topic in that we know that we have an understaffing crisis in corrections nationwide, which necessitates that staff, especially the officers, do a lot of mandatory overtime, which ends up them being short on sleep. And it's a very difficult situation to acknowledge and solve because it is. There are not enough bodies to fill the slot. So we want to go over all those slides and discuss issues and put our heads together towards the end about what can we do with something that is really a really difficult situation. So let's get going. Let's start. A quote from a researcher who does a lot of work in sleep, and he said that sleep is a biological requirement for human life. We sleep for the same reason we breathe and drink. It's an imperative. Yet we live in a society that devalues sleep. That's Michael Grandner, PhD. And so what he's saying here is that sleep is really a biological necessity, the same way that oxygen and water are. So if we were thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, sleep is at the bottom with the very, very basics for survival. And yet, how many of us really realize that we really need sleep to survive in the long term? And if we don't, then we have health impacts and repercussions. But as he says, we live in a society that devalues sleep. I think we live in a society or in a world that doesn't understand the importance of sleep and doesn't understand the necessity for sleep as a biological requirement, as a non-negotiable. We really maybe have not had enough research till maybe about a century ago about that. So let's go to the next slide. We're going to start with our overview. What is our outline for today? We're going to cover 5 points. Why do we need to sleep? Basically, what are the functions of sleep? What does it do? Why do we go sort of unconscious every day for a number of hours? What happens if we don't get enough sleep? What are the consequences? Then could sleep be considered a human right? And what are solutions to address correctional staff's sleep deficit issue in corrections, and also actually law enforcement in general? Police are in the same boat to some degree. And then a question at the end is, should there be any legal limits on the hours worked per 24-hour period in corrections like we have for some other professions? So let's go to the next slide with Greg. Thank you, Greg.
Thanks, Katerina. Thanks, Justin. And thank you to everybody who is here. It's unfortunate that there aren't snap your fingers solutions to this issue for us. What we want to talk about today is why biologically, scientifically, it is an issue for us as individuals. It's a systemic issue. It's built into the profession. It's built into the profession everywhere. And I'll just say really quickly,
yes, it's on.
If your organization, we're already getting some ideas on the chat. If your organization has come up with ideas or initiatives or programs about helping employees sleep more and more regularly, please put those on the chat so that we can capture those as best we can to pass on to the profession as a whole ideas that people are using that are working about how to deal with this systemic inherent problem. So we're going to start with the definition, and I'll say that these first few slides are pretty scientific. In other words, there's a lot of multi-syllable words here. The first slide here is not so much, but you'll see as we go along. I'll do a little bit of description, but there's much more to be said about the brain science of sleep. So this definition, a naturally recurring, reversible, thank goodness, state of perceptual disengagement from perceptions, reduced consciousness, and relative immobility. So disengagement, reduced consciousness, immobility, what that tells us is that we think that, or the way we interpret that, I guess, is to think that sleep is where nothing happens. It's quiet. It's usually dark, very little motion. Our body's at rest. We rest. So what we want to do today is start to emphasize how much work the body actually does while we are sleeping, what the body naturally does while we are sleeping. Sleep is a time of important biological activity. If we don't sleep, that activity doesn't happen. We may think nothing is happening, which is why we think we can do without it. But if we do go without it, we also go without the natural biological processes that we need. Creating silent damage is essentially what it amounts to. We think of sleep as a time of rest, but it might be more accurate to think of it as a time of recovery. One of the quotes that I read doing background for this webinar is, sleep quality is the currency of resilience. Resilience is an important characteristic in our profession. Sleep quality contributes to that. So what you've seen here on this slide, biological necessity, essential for health and well-being, involves multiple brain regions, we'll talk about that, and endocrine systems. The neural circuits are on-off electrical connections. Endocrine systems, hormonal signals run through our bloodstream, enables the body to rest and recover, like we said. We all know about 7 to 9 hours of sleep. The urge to sleep builds after being awake for 15 to 17 hours. That might sound familiar to some people. And insufficient sleep harms our physical and mental well-being. Go ahead, Justin. Okay, the first two that at the top there that I want to mention: reduces sympathetic nervous system arousal, stress response, increases parasympathetic activation, rest and recovery. The sympathetic nervous system is what allows us to respond to stress and threat. It's what activates our muscles, activates our heart, activates our circulatory system and our breathing. The parasympathetic system is when we recover. What people find is that as we're trying to sleep, as we're trying to fall asleep, if we're worried about getting enough sleep, we never shut off our sympathetic nervous system. The stress response and our heart rate continues. So what a person is trying to do as we fall asleep is to increase our parasympathetic activation. And I will note that if you do any work into breathing practices, that's almost in every case what is trying to be accomplished, to increase the parasympathetic system, the rest and recovery system through breathing. Sleep increases immune system health, regulates inflammation, replenishes and programs immune systems, strengthens both innate immunity and adaptive immunity. And then the last one, essentially what this last one means is sleep allows the brain to take out the trash. Cerebrospinal fluid washes out toxic metabolic waste in neurons. Well, what is toxic metabolic waste? Well, that is the waste from all of the bodily activities that happen to us, in us, with us, while we're awake. And the brain flushes that out of the cerebrospinal fluid, flushes that out of the brain, as we're sleeping. If we don't sleep, that metabolic waste piles up in our brain. So I want to start with that top line there and emphasize something. We repair our brain neurons while we sleep. Repairs DNA, including telomere repair, reduces oxidative stress. Okay, telomeres are this might be one of those words that you want to write down if you're not familiar with it and do some research. Telomeres are the tips of all of our strands of DNA. They're often described as like the plastic tips of shoelaces, but they wear out over time. In fact, they're very closely connected with aging. There's a whole neurological theory about how telomere wear is where aging happens. Those tips on the ends of all of our strands of DNA. And so one of the things that sleep does, as I said, what sleep is naturally doing is allowing us to live longer. The next two pieces, memory consolidation, learning facilitation, those are brain activities that happen in different parts of the brain that happen while we're sleeping. Got a story to go with that here later on. And I want to jump down to the very last one, ghrelin and leptin level control. Okay, what does that have to do with anything? Relates hunger and satiation hormones. Ghrelin is the hormone that circulates through our body that increases our hunger. So sleep reduces ghrelin. If we don't sleep enough, we are hungry more often. And leptin then is the opposite. Leptin reduces the hunger pangs. But if we don't sleep sufficiently, leptin is reduced and the hunger pangs increase. So we'll talk about obesity and weight gain and so on later on, but these are the hormones that affect that while we sleep. So once again, the body is actually naturally doing something to keep us alive as we're sleeping. Benefits: restores and repairs the brain, just like we said. Some of the emerging research connects it actually to Alzheimer's disease, strengthens memory and boosts learning. We've all had that experience, I think. Creativity, decision-making, boosts mood stability and reduces risk of mood disorders. We definitely, I'm sure, have all had that experience. We don't sleep, we're irritable. Supports heart health, weight control, lowers accident risk by reducing fatigue and drowsiness. So what happens then with insufficient sleep? Like our physical well-being, mental and emotional health rely on a delicate balance. Myriad choices maintain that balance. Even a single sleepless night can therefore do damage. a lot of this may be obvious when we put it in these terms, but what we want to emphasize is the scientific research that has been done on this subject. We deal with it constantly, every day, as a personal issue, cognitively, emotionally, physically. What we're advocating for here with this webinar is to increase the scientific understanding in our profession of this issue. We think of it as a comfort issue, maybe, like I said, but it is much more significant physiologically and biologically than that. After 24 hours of no sleep, our brain begins to act as if it is drunk. After 24 hours of sustained wakefulness, participants' cognitive and motor performance is equal to or worse than blood alcohol level of 0.1. In other words, over the legal limit for driving. 18 hours without sleep, blood alcohol content of 0.05. Our body acts as if it's drunk when we haven't slept sufficiently. Lack of sleep in college students' mental health. Well, you could read those numbers there. This is, again, scientific research about how our mood disorders, our mental health is affected by sleep. So my story, I have a college story that doesn't have to do with mental health, it had to do with cognition and thinking. Early in my decades ago college career, there is a punchline to this story, by the way. Early in my college career, I was taking a math class, the hardest math class I ever took. I was getting a pretty good grade in it, maybe an A-. Came time for the final, and I decided I was going to study myself crazy to get a full A in the class. And so I intentionally pulled an all-nighter, working through all the formulas, drinking cup after cup of decaf or of coffee, not decaf coffee, and went to the test that morning. 2 days later, I get the results. I got a 98 on the test. Sounds great, right? Yeah, well, it was 98 out of 300. I had failed the test after having stayed up all night. What was interesting to me is I pulled up the test and I looked at the formula that I'd written on the test. I wasn't in doubt about any of them. I didn't cross any out. I didn't erase anything. I was just wrong. My brain had not functioned properly. And this is an example, I think, that many of us have had, is that we don't even realize how affected we are. Katerina will talk about this later in her slides, how affected we are when we don't sleep. Here's a slide about how our blood pressure increases. That's obviously related to heart disease. Healthy volunteers deprived of 1 night of sleep. Activity of the prefrontal cortex decrease. Activity linking the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex is decreased. Okay, what does that mean? The prefrontal cortex, that's right behind our forehead. That's where the executive functions of the brain happen, our decision making. The amygdala is actually, there are 2 of them, small, shaped like almonds, right, almost exactly in the middle of the brain. They're part of the limbic system, which is the emotional center of the brain, the emotional functions of the brain. The amygdala is the first part of the brain, the amygdala neurons that react to threats. When we're threatened, well, we're walking down the hall and somebody jumps out from a doorway to scare us. The amygdala is what fires to respond to that threat. But then it connects to the prefrontal cortex so that the prefrontal cortex can help us make a decision about what we just experienced. Is that a real threat or is that not a threat? Is that just one of your friends jumping out from behind a doorway to scare you? And if that's the case, then you need to respond appropriately. If it's something more dangerous, then you need to respond appropriately too. The amygdala and the prefrontal cortex have to be connected in order to manage threat response. The amygdala otherwise will fire and fire and fire, and we will respond to threats when they don't exist. And then we also have impaired self-regulation, mood, and increased anxiety and depression. I think we've all had. I guess I would say that we've all had those experiences where anxiety and mood and inability to regulate our emotions is affected by sleep. Drowsy driving. We're going to talk about. Well, actually, go ahead. You can see the numbers there. 91,000 crashes, 50,000 injuries, 795 deaths annually from the National Traffic Safety Administration due to drowsy driving. Again, I would imagine that many of us have had that experience. That happens a lot with what's called microsleep. So go to the next slide, Justin. Microsleep is involuntary due to sleep deficit. Parts of the brain fall asleep for 15 seconds or less. When you've gone without sleep for an extended period of time, I'm sure again we've all had the experience of just nodding our head and then coming back. That is what is called microsleep. Rapid shifts between wakefulness and sleep. Eyes may be open. Person may be unaware of having experienced a microsleep. You can see the other bullet points there. I want to emphasize reduced alertness and reaction time, because as I think back on my career, the staff who have most commented on experiences of microsleep have been tower officers. Tower officers on night shift, late swing shift, and so on. Don't know if given staffing the way it is now, whether people even run their towers on night shift. But that was a place where those were a group of staff that frequently talked about their microsleep experiences and how often it happened during the night. And of course, they're armed and allowed to use deadly force, even with reduced alertness and reduced reaction time. I'm going to pass it on to Katarina now to talk about long-term consequences of lack of sleep.
Using the term here that we haven't introduced so far, partial chronic sleep deprivation, because that's a more accurate term than just sleep deprivation. Usually people think of sleep deprivation as entire, complete sleep deprivation, like you don't allow somebody to sleep for an entire day or 2 or 3. But we're talking here about partial sleep deprivation. So it's only like short, sleeping only 3 or 4 or 5 hours a night or a day. It's chronic. It goes on over a period of time. It's not just one night of missing sleep. And what are the effects of that? When you have that go on where people sleep from 3 to 6 hours a day over weeks and months at a time or years at a time, what could be long-term consequences? So one thing one researcher said is that basically when you're alert, your body, your brain is working. And that's why it produces, by the way, those byproducts, the waste that needs to be flushed out during our sleep time, which is really an amazing thing to think about, that we have little pumps in the brain that flush out all the debris of the days. It's like the exhaust from running the vehicle, flushing them out. So that these things accumulate if we don't get enough sleep and the system gets overloaded. And what they found with experiments, not with humans, but with animals, is cells literally die. Neuron cells literally die if they are forced to stay active for a period of time, for even just 30% longer each day. They give up. They cannot keep up. They cannot do it. So they have limits, which I never thought they would. Way back in my 20s, when I was going to college, I mean, it was no big deal to not sleep for a night or two. It was like fun, and didn't realize the impact. And one thing I want to say, because it came through in a question, is that all the research I've seen, people agree we need, as adults, we need between 7 to 9 hours of sleep, and ideally consecutively in one stretch, because we go through, like, there are 4 stages of sleep, and we start with different brain wavelengths for each stage. So we need ideally to have those 7 to 9 hours of sleep consecutively, so we can go through all those 4 stages, including the REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, the spindles, the whatever, theta waves, alpha waves, all those good waves. And so partial chronic sleep deprivation is anything less than that, anything less than those 7 hours per 24 hours. And again, like with the short-term effects, we have impact on our thinking, our mood, and our body. They're all affected. And so I was thinking that, the term beauty sleep, maybe there's some truth to that. When Greg was talking about how sleep helps the body fix the telomeres at the end of our chromosomes, which cause aging if they're not working right. So maybe they do contribute to our beauty. I mean, the way that we look. Then we have a Dr. Raidi, I would think her name is pronounced, who focuses on sleep, and she does research with a VA, I believe, and she talks about how we know that sleep restriction, that's the term she uses, affects the brain and the body, in that we talked about the lowering of response time, impairing mental performance, lowering testosterone, which I didn't know about, and more. So there's a price to pay for cutting ourselves short, or having to cut ourselves short on sleep. Definitely the body cannot recover, and it stays impaired. So again, with long-term partial chronic sleep deprivation, we have serious stuff happening. Heart disease, and it's kind of scary when you see the numbers. We have some other numbers afterwards. Lack of sleep makes us resistant to insulin, which means that increases the risk of type 2 diabetes, because that's what type 2 diabetes involves, insulin resistance. It increases Alzheimer's dementia because the brain has not been able to flush out those byproduct proteins, the junk, the debris that happens after we think and are awake all day. So they keep accumulating and accumulating and accumulating, and they impair the communication between nerve cells in our brain. And it increases inflammation in the body, where the body is in that revved up state of fight or flight at the cellular level, which increases, for some reason, it increases cancer risk, and the whole immune system goes haywire, overreacting to things. Maybe I've underreacted, but definitely I've seen the overreacting evidence that it really becomes, it can't unwind. So we don't want to have the body suffer from these things. They are hard to shake once they set in. And I hope I'm not making you depressed. It's just we're trying to become aware and help one another, because we are talking about wellness all the time. And I'm thinking that sleep is such a foundation of wellness that if we do all kinds of other stuff, like think of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If I do levels 2, 3, 4, 5, but 1 is shaky, I don't think we're going to go very far. So with sleep-deprived people, I can give them the best gym in the world, I can give them the best food in the world, but with not enough sleep, they're still going to be lagging health-wise. So some statistics from the World Health Organization, that long working hours were associated with a big number of deaths from stroke and heart disease, insufficient blood. 745,000, man. And that was a 29% increase since 2000, which made me wonder, does that mean our working hours have increased? Maybe they have. And we have that jump in the association between long working hours and heart disease and stroke. And then there was a very interesting study about people aging, brain aging, which they measured through scans regarding brain shrinkage. They had 3 groups: people who said they had very few sleep problems at night. Some people said so, whatever the middle was, the average, the middle, and then the high number. And they found that when they took the low group with the low numbers of sleep problems who slept more or less great every night. The people with the middle number of problems had an age of the brain estimated through the scans 1.6 years older, and those with a high group 2.6 years older. That's a chunk. And they studied people over 15 years to see how their brain aged over time. So that was one more study on the whole issue of sleep quality and impact of on health. And then we talked about how many hours do we need, and we said 7 till 9. There was one study about what happens when people sleep less than 5 hours a night and what kind of risk that puts them in. If people slept less than they were, and they followed them over a number of years. So people who were up to 69, 50 to 69, who slept less 5 hours or less per night, they had 30% increased risk for multiple chronic diseases versus people who slept at least 7 hours a night. And then at 70 years, if they kept it up, it bumped up to 40% higher risk, which is pretty high. And these are the kinds of diseases we talked about earlier, the diabetes, cancer, heart disease, etc. And even Parkinson's made it on that list. So again, telling us that sleep time is not just a waste of time. It's a recovery time, a healing time for the body to pull itself together and do life again the next day. I used to think, boy, it wouldn't be nice if I could sleep only 2 or 3 hours a night and be refreshed and not need all that sleep. But how much time am I wasting? And then I realized that no, I need it if I am to function as a human being. Now, we're talking about shift work here, and they've done studies with nurses and other professions. And guys, it's not nice to see that slide. It's because a lot of people work shift work, and sometimes they change. I remember one system that changed people's shift work every quarter. I mean, their shift schedule every quarter, so they could go from days to nights to swing every quarter. So their body would get used to one way of operating, their hormone release for waking and sleeping, the circadian rhythm. They would get used to it, and then they have to be jerked right back out and start over with another shift, which totally would confuse the body and the brain as far as what do we secrete here? Do we secrete a hormone to wake up or to go to sleep? And these are very delicate operations with feedback loops, and you don't just throw a switch and your body changes. And if you've had jet lag ever, you know what I'm talking about. So the research is very robust, very solid, that long-term shift work affects life expectancy for all causes and cardiovascular and the risk to disease, and affects, of course, our melatonin production, etc., metabolism, aging, speeded up, mental health. That blows my mind that it increases the risks of suicide. And then a study that Greg described earlier with healthy student athletes, which were top of the line, healthy kids, with every additional night of lack of enough sleep, they would get that increase in all those symptoms. With each additional night, it was like escalating. And then the whole thing of cognitive functioning, increased accidents and mistakes, the whole thing of attention. I remember somebody telling me that they were a truck driver. He was a truck driver. He couldn't remember stretches of the road at all because he was so tired and sleep deprived. He couldn't remember because he had been pushing himself way too hard, in spite of the limits for driving time for truck drivers. So there is a cost to shift work. So, and yes, we have a shift differential, but does it make up for our lives? That's a big question. A lot of us have thought, me one of them, like, hey, maybe I can make up for it over the weekend. Is that true? Does that happen? Can we make up for what they call sleep debt? Sleep debt is the difference between what amount of sleep you need versus what amount of sleep you get. So if you need, let's say, 8 hours of sleep to feel rested when you wake up and your head is clear, but you get only 4, then your sleep debt is 4 hours because you needed 8, you got 4. You're in the red 4 hours. And by the way, has anybody woken up with insufficient sleep and felt like they had cobwebs in their brain? They couldn't think straight? That's the experience of having all the debris, all the waste material in the brain that has not been flushed out because we didn't sleep long enough. So can we make up for that on the weekend by sleeping 12 hours? Let's see what the research shows. A researcher says that it does not appear to be an effective strategy to reverse the sleep loss induced disruptions of metabolism. They're saying not quite. There are 2 studies that I found, actually 3. One says that the insulin resistance did not get improved after people made up for insufficient sleep on the weekend. So their diabetes risk stayed right where it was before. It did not go down. One study showed that it may help cardiovascular disease reduction, the risk go down. Another one said it didn't. So the jury's out. There may be some hope for the heart part, but definitely doesn't for the insulin part, the metabolic part. And so it's kind of an eye-opener, like, oh my gosh, I cannot just make up for it. I'm still in the red. I need to do something else, which is sleep more consistently longer. The other thing that is kind of scary, and Greg and I discussed it, is that people, if they have been, let's say they have them in the lab, they didn't let them sleep for 2 or 3 days, or let them sleep maybe a few hours, and then they let them sleep a nice long stretch, normal 8-hour, 9-hour sleep, great. A few days later, they're fine. What the researchers found was that even though people felt rested after they recovered through normal nights of sleep, their cognitive, the information processing, thinking impairment still hung on. And they were unaware of it. They thought they were doing fine. And they overestimated how well they were doing. And so they had a false sense of security that I got this, I'm fine, I'm good to go. And they were not, because the tests showed that they were failing. They were not passing certain requirements. So it's kind of scary to see that we may be deluding ourselves, thinking we bounce back and that we're functioning, but our performance shows otherwise. So you can imagine what that may look like behind the wheel, driving home, or driving to work, what that may look like managing a very intense moment with a confrontation somewhere, where you think you're thinking clearly and you're not. And of course, a lot of experiments get done on poor little mice, and they found that when they kept them for a few days without any sleep, brain cell death happened. Just brain cells just quit, died. That's it. And inflammation was activated in the prefrontal cortex, and all the junk waste proteins accumulated in the mice brain. Then they let them sleep normally for a year, have normal sleep, and then in spite of that, the brain damage and inflammation were there. They had not gone away. And so they're saying, are these irreversible? Is this damage long lasting, and are we stuck with it? Now, this is a mouse brain. I mean, it's not a human brain, but it's kind of like a wake up call. Like, am I giving myself brain damage? What's happening here? And again, our purpose is not to depress people. It's a sobering time to say we have to figure out better ways to deal with the sleep debt, because we're going to pay a price. And what if a lot of times we talk about life expectancy being shorter for correctional officers in particular? What if sleep deprivation, insufficient sleep, what if it has something to do with that? Not just stress and in other ways. So now this is a question, could this be considered a human right? And I've thought about that, and I thought, well, is drinking water and breathing oxygen a human right? Well, it's a necessity. Let's see what the United Nations state in one of their articles. They have something called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and they have something called Article 24. the right to rest and leisure, and they state everyone has the right to rest and leisure, including a reasonable limitation of working hours and periodic holidays with pay. So based on that, I would say, yeah, there is a human right to rest, and it's really rooted not in a whim, on a whim, and like whatever I feel like. It's rooted in having a biological need to sleep and rest in order to maintain health and to survive. There have been some, I'll give you very briefly, study I did not include here, actually a couple of them, where they kept puppies awake for days on end. They would not let them sleep at all. I don't know how they could have the heart to conduct these experiments at the early 1900s. They all died. The last one died after 24 days of no sleep. And they had terrible brain issues, brain bleeding and shrinkage and all kinds of stuff. So is it a human right? I would say yes, in the sense that it's a necessity for survival. So that is my take for right now, until I'm going to turn it over to Greg. Thank you, Greg.
We're going to do just a couple of slides here, which are going to be already familiar to everybody, about what are the agency consequences, what are the professional consequences, not just the personal consequences. This next slide is a researcher coming on 32-hour shifts, which I've seen in the chats that there are a number of people who are doing that. We know long work hours and shift work and sleep deprivation degrades performance, productivity, safety, health, and well-being. It can increase misconduct, accident risk. It can impair judgment, the ability to respond quickly, affect relationships with the community. And this researcher emphasizes this has been pretty well established for several decades. One of the things that when we get into the question and answer, the discussion part of the program, I want to talk about is how, as a culture, we ignore these known realities. They've been well established, but anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. I want to talk about that a little bit. How we culturally ignore these factors. And what we've got now for the next few slides is just some examples of what happens with sleep deficits and the liability related. Motor vehicle accidents, errors due to attention lapses, accidents on site, mishap. Anyway, all of these things are familiar. Excessive force due to impaired self-regulation and executive functioning. That would be an interesting personal study for people to carry out for themselves, is how well do you regulate your emotions in difficult challenging events with the offenders you supervise, and the decision making that you're required to do. And then mental illness and suicide. We'll get an example of that here in a minute. Increased odds. So this is a police officer research. Increased odds of public complaints. Less sleep in the 24 hours before a shift. 24 hours, wow. Working back-to-back night shifts, physical fatigue, greater sleepiness. This, we're not going to pull this article up, but if you then, after this webinar gets posted on YouTube, you'll be able to pull up the link. Excessive mandatory overtime blamed by family for jail deputy suicide. This is a California, Los Angeles County case. Worked excessive overtime and committed suicide. I'm not sure how the case resolved itself, but that was a real case, just like the next ones are. News items and anecdotal information about car accidents after long work hours, often associated with working overtime. And there are many, many of these links and news stories. We just provided 3 of them that have to do with the specific subject here, working long hours and car accidents, driving to and from work. I did some work in a middle of the country, Midwest institution. It was a 1,200 bed medium custody institution, but it was in a small town of about 2,000 to 3,000 people. Well, so they had four 400 staff. Most of those staff had to commute an hour both ways just to get to work. The town was too small to support the size of the institution. People came from out of town. So there was always, even with mandatory overtimes, there was always going to be another hour of awake time and micro sleep while you're driving on the way home. So go ahead, Justin. I'm going to pass this on to Katerina here in a second. Solutions. This is the very, very, if the previous parts of the presentation have been difficult, this is even more difficult. There have been so many questions that people have asked about what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? Well, we want to get to some of those. And if you have solutions yourself, please pass them on. I want to just read one more slide, and then I'm going to give it to Katerina, because this next slide is one of Katerina's slides. And I don't know how to emphasize it any stronger than what she has written here. Only radical and creative measures can address the very real and devastating iceberg of a threat to staff's health and functioning and to the quality of effectiveness of correctional agencies' operations. Only radical and creative measures. I've said it a couple times, what we're talking about here is relevant to us individually, but it's systemic. It's built into the profession. It is everywhere. The only way we will be able to fix this, quote unquote, fix, is considering and practicing, is that the right word? Radical and creative measures. So if you are in a position to suggest or implement, even on a trial basis, what you might think of typically as a radical and creative measure to address sleep, something you've never done before, way out of the box thinking, that is, I think, possibly the doorway to helping us solve this as a profession. Katerina?
Thank you. Yes, and I wrote back in, I think in 2021, I wrote an article called "The Titanic That Will Sink." That will sink the correctional system, and it was about sleep deprivation, partial chronic sleep deprivation, and that's why there's a word here about iceberg. It's about the iceberg that would sink the Titanic, being sleep deprivation, and I really still believe that, because it's so silent and quiet, and we take it so for granted that people operate on 4 and 5 hours of sleep on a hugely long-term basis, like for years. And we think we can get away with it, and we can't. And people either make mistakes or lose it with somebody and do use excessive force or kill somebody on their way home or themselves. Mistakes, people forget to lock doors, all kinds of things happen. So, and there's no easy answer, because really the only real answer would be, and don't laugh kind of sarcastically, but really the only real answer, which is in the next slide, for agencies, is to have more people. And we know we're in the middle of a staffing crisis, and which of course gets perpetuated when people hear that they would have to do all those mandatory overtime shifts. They don't want to do the job. They don't want to go higher on in corrections. So in the next slide, I put down 3 suggestions: more staff, and I have that in capitals, because really the only real solution is for enough people to be there to do the job, so we don't have to mandate people. And even we can limit maybe even voluntary overtime, because I remember once years ago, I had an administrator call me and say, are there any studies about limiting the amount of voluntary overtime? Because he could see some people were working way too long, way too much, and they were not doing well. But they were opting to do overtime voluntarily, but they were not functioning properly. So this is not being cruel coming up with that first bullet. This is the real factual solution, really, unless we get a whole new set of brains that's not human. Then having as much as we can consistent shift scheduling, so the body can get in a groove to know when it releases which hormone to either wake us up or puts us to sleep and keep us asleep or keep us awake. Because when we jerk it around back and forth, it gets very confused. It doesn't know what to do. And I've talked to staff that told me that they got so depressed on working the night shift that they thought they were going to kill themselves. And one of them quit entirely. Others were able to get out of there to a more stable shift or get out of the officer position to have day jobs because they knew they were sinking. So with the lack of consistency and being jerked physically around with the shift schedules changing. And then another thing to think about, to begin to think about for corrections, is the whole thing of could we get statutory limitations to the hours of people are mandated to sleep, to work in corrections? Is that a possibility? And what has been done in other professions? And so let's take a quick look at the 3 other professions. As you probably know, if you've been stuck in an airport and they tell you, well, the crew is not in yet because they were late getting in last night, so they have to get enough time off before they can come back and fly another plane, because they have to have a max of 9 hours of flight time in a 24-hour period. Like, why did we do that? There is a reason why we are doing that, right? Like safety. Duh. I mean, like, of course. We don't want to have a micro sleep event as the pilots are flying or truck drivers are driving who have a maximum of 11 hours of sleep in a 14-hour shift and after 10 hours off duty. So with those micro sleeps, people don't have a clue that they have checked out and they are disengaged from the environment. They're not taking in information. So that's why we have those limits. Imagine a truck driver going into micro sleep mode and crossing the median and plowing into a bunch of vehicles and then waking up like 15 seconds later, like, whoa, what happened? So we have airline pilots, truck drivers, and in the next slide, we have the air traffic controllers. Although I did hear that they are being forced due to shortages themselves to work more hours, but on the books with FAA, they are to have a maximum shift length of 10 consecutive hours with breaks included, which again is about honoring and respecting the fact that the brain can sustain focused attention in a sharp way only for so long at a time. Otherwise, it goes in and out. We think we're on, but we're off. And we think the brain is online, but it's offline. And they have 2 hours on position without a break. So they have limits to like 40 hours weekly, 24 hours consecutive work. So we have those professions, and there are some also for surgeons, for residents in the medical profession. But I picked those 3 here, and it's like, could we do something like that? And could that happen with the shortages that we have for staff? And then how does mandatory overtime and having people work with being sleep deprived seriously for months and years at a time, how does that affect safety and OSHA's limits for safety? I looked into some some attorneys' websites and legal arguments, and there was a statement about how mandatory overtime may not be legal if it creates a safety hazard. And that's according to OSHA too, that it then it's not legal. And there are limits to truck drivers driving more than a certain number of hours, etc. So, but there's no specific number given as to how many hours people can work mandatory overtime per week or per 2 weeks. It's something to think about. How much of that is legal when we know that people's functioning is impaired, so that they're not that safe anymore, and they think they are. They think they're doing fine, but they're not. There is a statement by ACLU, National Prison Project person called David Fatty, and he says that corrections officers perform a vital public safety function, keeping incarcerated people, staff, and the general public safe. If you wouldn't want to take your chances on an airline pilot or a surgeon who's been working for 32 hours straight, you should be very concerned about corrections officers working for 32 hours straight. We've heard of even quadruple shifts, which is unbelievable. Really knowing the biology and neurobiology of the body regarding sleep, it's frightening. Like what, and especially given the complexity of the job of a correctional officer. So, and again, no easy answers about the hard truth that the only thing to avoid the harms of insufficient sleep is preventing sleep deficits by getting enough sleep. And the irony is that, let's say somebody's worked up, the sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight at its peak, then they get home, they have time to sleep, but they cannot unwind because they're so wound up, and they cannot fall asleep because they're so wound up, and that kind of feeds the deprivation on top of the actual work hours. And that's when also people get hooked on certain maybe habit-forming sleep aids or alcohol to go to sleep. And that backfires in the middle of the night after the alcohol wears off. So the only way out is preventing sleep deficits by getting enough sleep and creating conditions that protect and promote the body being able to unplug and go into recovery mode, slow down and go into recovery mode. So then we have a couple of slides just talking about what can one do practically. What can what can we do ourselves to try to protect our sleep? Of course, this is not, again, a cruel joke. The first bullet, this is not just a dream, but this is the consistent research saying that we need 7 to 9 hours per day, trying to keep it consistent so the body knows what to do at which time. Again, the quiet, dark, keep the bed like to have associations for bed with sleep and sex only, not do work in bed, eat in bed, or whatever else. Not getting worked up with video games, whatever, or other screen time before going to sleep that revs us up. Ideally, no alcohol, because when alcohol wears off, then there is arousal from suppressing certain things. Then there's arousal when it wears off and people wake up. And good ways to unwind. See a physician if needed for some sleep aids. Sometimes some people have used antidepressants as a sleep aid that was not habit forming, and avoid habit forming drugs like benzodiazepines for sleep. They will work a bit short term, but then they will exact their price down the road. And then, of course, major other health tips in the next slide that are about eating well and protecting our body and our brain specifically, and preventative medical care and a healthy lifestyle. These are kind of like additional. But the point will be managing to carve out the time to sleep, to unwind first and then sleep. And then let's go to the last slide with a quote from another sleep researcher. And she says, we'll all inevitably will miss out on sleep from time to time, but our society should critically examine structures such as work norms that prevent people from getting enough rest. And then she says that the science of sleep and mental health suggests that failing to address those problems will leave people vulnerable to serious harm. And we know it now. We're an informed consumer. It's like, what do we do about it? And again, like I said, there are no easy answers, but we need to sound the alarm that this is, if we want wellness, we have to really look at this. We cannot act like we don't need to sleep. We would never act like we don't need to drink water, or we don't need oxygen, or we don't need food. We would never think of doing that, but we do that with sleep. And I think it's because we didn't understand its importance, because you don't have an immediate major consequence hitting you in the face. You don't pass out after one night of not sleeping, or whatever it might be. It adds up over time. So we covered what are the nature and functions of sleep, the whole thing of short-term and long-term consequences of not getting enough sleep. Ask the question of sleep a human right? And trying to throw around some thoughts about solutions and see what you guys say. So we have a bunch of questions, and we thank you for attending. And again, the purpose of this webinar is to kind of sound an alarm about a very real need that is usually in our blind spot. And we don't have all the answers. I wish we did. I wish I could snap my fingers and have millions of correctional officers waiting to apply at your agency to be hired. Um, so if you have any questions, we can go for it. And Justin, I don't know how you want to proceed, but go ahead. Thank you.
Let's go ahead and ask some questions from the chat. The first question I see that I kind of want to ask is, does age affect the amount of sleep needed?
Does age? My understanding is that people that they're like babies, young children, and older folks like me need more sleep than if you're maybe in your 30s or 40s. We definitely need those 7 to 9 hours, but everybody needs a 7. Maybe we need 8 to 9. I never thought I would need 9 hours, but I can tell you that when I sleep 9 hours, sometimes I feel really well. So yes, it seems to, but it's not a radical. It's not a radical thing like, in your 30s you can get away with 3 hours or 4 hours of sleep. Nope, 7 is there, and I've heard that some people can do fine on 4, but I've heard them say that, but I've never seen any research that backs that up. Yes.
I'm sorry, Katerina, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
Can I jump in on that, Justin, before we move to the next subject? The cultural question, one of the slides that Katerina just did a few slides back had to do with society's discussions about sleep. The cultural question of how much sleep do people need is really contrary to the science of sleep. Well, we hear a lot about people who say they only need 4 hours of sleep, and that allows them to be productive and creative and do great things. And we had one question earlier about I'm very busy and I want to actually do with less sleep. We end up with a cultural expectation that sleep is not necessary. And if there's anything we're trying to provide, I guess, today is the recognition that is not the case. If it's true that somebody else can get by with 4 hours of sleep, that's fine for them, but that doesn't mean that is the case for you. I think in many cases it probably came back to us as children because of what our parents believed about sleep. And after we got to the age of 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 and we were sleeping all night finally so that they could sleep, then it's, well, you need to get up and get to work. You need to get up and get to work. Maybe that's not a common expectation or a common experience, that other people have had, but I think it is pretty common that we've been told since we were young that sleep really isn't that necessary. We need to be working more than sleeping. Okay, I understand all of that, but functioning without sleep, it is incredibly damaging to the body. How much does a person need? Well, the science of that will make you laugh, because the only way to know that is to go someplace for an extended period of time without any other obligations, and then sleep until you get up, and then go about your day, and then go back to sleep and sleep. That doesn't happen. That's the cultural impact that we have on us individually that impacts our sleep. Anyway, it's quite a bother. I guess I'll shut up there, but it's quite a bother that we tell ourselves from a young age and then try to apply ourselves to somebody else who is not keeping their body in good shape also.
Thank you, Greg and Katerina. Next question. It's kind of going to be a two-part question because somebody asked, how can I get a better night's sleep? And it was followed up with the use of sleep aids like melatonin, Tylenol PM, things like that, and the ramifications that could have. What are your thoughts on sleep aids and how to get better sleep?
I think it would be good to talk about that with people that some are natural, whatever, naturopathic doctors or medical doctors, to discuss that with them. I know that as we get older, our body produces less melatonin. It's kind of interesting that in Europe, melatonin is not allowed to be sold over the counter, and whereas here it is widely available in different amounts and different dosages. So I would say discuss it with your doctors because a lot of those things could interact with each other and one negate the other. Like this morning, I was reading that if people ate too much cinnamon, it will stop their medications, whatever medications they were, from working. And so I would say consult with a physician, some kind of person who's a specialist in those things, but explore them. And that's why we have all the sleepy time tea and whatever there is out there. And of course, there are other ways to get the body to calm down too, to prepare it. And I know other people who take hot baths, whatever, to prepare it for that relaxed state. And but definitely consult with somebody, especially if you're on any kind of medication, because of interactions that could happen.
I want to add two things. One is that it's come up in several different comments that people have made about I can't get to sleep. I have a hard time getting to sleep, and so on. I mentioned breathing practices. A very simple way to gain information about this is just Google, just research military breathing practices for sleep. What does the U.S. military recommend for soldiers to sleep? That they don't recommend these medicinal practices. They recommend breathing practices. And that is, way back in the beginning, talked about the parasympathetic nervous system. Those breathing practices are what allow the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and relaxation part of the nervous system, to kick in. And those are what promotes sleep, I guess I would say. Anyway, that would be my recommendation. Do that research. What does the U.S. military recommend in terms of breathing practices for soldiers to get sleep? It's fascinating and it works. That I think gets to several comments that people have made about not being able to get to sleep quickly.
And I think making that decision to not be trying to problem solve, because I've fallen in that hole a few times, trying to think about something, and the more we engage the thinking brain, the more we wake up. But if we go back into, like people used to talk about counting sheep, whatever, you disengage the brain from thinking, problem solving, putting it in a mode of just routine, repetitive, like 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. And then the whole thing of breathing that Greg talked about stimulates the vagal nerve, stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system, brings us a sense of calmness. And but kind of intentionally saying, nope, I'm not going to problem solve right now. I'm going to put this on the shelf. I'll pick it up tomorrow morning. Now it's time to sink into blissful sleep. And obviously don't drink coffee before going to bed unless you have ADHD, and then it helps you go to sleep, from some people I know. But yes, it's really tricky when you come home from work revved up because of something that happened that day. I mean, anybody would have a hard time after certain days because of what happened at work. So going for a walk, taking that hot bath, whatever, to kind of unwind.
And we just had a comment. I've tried that, but the other part of my brain is not cooperating. Yeah, that's the cognitive neurological battle that is happening between your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And I'm sorry to be rude or blunt about it, but that's why practice is a way to succeed. Just keep at it.
And I know somebody else in another training brought out the fact that, excuse the point, that sexual activity can help people unwind and go to sleep. So it's one of those. So anything that puts the body in a relaxed state.
All right, thank you.
We didn't talk about screen time, but that is one thing that that sleep scientists very much argue against: reducing screen time in the last 2 or so hours before blue light screen time, the last 2 hours or so before sleep. I'm not sure of the biology there, but that comes up quite frequently.
Thank you for your response on those. Another question, and I think I know the answer to this, but I'm going to let the experts weigh in on it.
Yeah.
Can you justify cheating on your sleep short term to push forward in your life?
And of course, the thing that I'm thinking about is that, do we have a contradiction, short term and pushing forward in your life? Because short term might be like a day or two, and we saw that even one night of sleep deprivation, what they did to people, and probably they would recover after a while. But to push forward in your life, you probably need to do it a lot more often than one night. So it really becomes long term. It's not short term. And then you have to make some hard decisions. I mean, everybody has to make their own decisions. Like, I mean, I can think of a single mom that had to raise 2 children, and she really put in a lot of hours to go to college to be able to feed her family. And it was a sacrifice. So it's important to remember that if you do that, it is a sacrifice, and you are going to pay a price for it physically and emotionally. But maybe you're going to get enough of a reward that you think is worth it, or be self-sacrificing, I guess, for the sake of like this mom's children, for example. So the only thing I can say is that there's no such thing as a free lunch, and there is no such thing as getting away with less sleep and not paying a price. It's just like having to decide, is this price worth paying for or not? I can see myself saying, yeah, this one is paying worth it. Like I have somebody that is in an emergency, in a crisis. I would lose sleep and go be with them, do whatever. But I will pay the price. And I'm willingly deciding to pay a price, but it will still be a price to pay. It will not be forgiven debt. I'll still have to pay that debt and carry it, maybe long term, and depending on how often that happens. So
we just had a question about naps, and I'll just add one last thing. We're really running out of time. One of the sleep researchers that I've spent some time with suggests that if you are a shift worker, to sleep the last 90 minutes before you have to get up and go to work. That regardless of how you sleep the rest of the time, but to sleep the 90 minutes before you have to get up and go to work. Sleep cycles often run on a 90-minute schedule, and giving yourself that amount of time to sleep before you go to work can be helpful.
If you can knock yourself out, so to speak, and go to sleep at will.
Yes, if all of that, because we'll spend our time like one of our participants said, with the two parts of our brain arguing with each other about, I need to sleep. Well, you can't. Well, you can't, and so on, and that just keeps us awake. Yeah,
I know people who can go to sleep at will, put their head back on the pillow and go to sleep. I'm not one of them. So, So, yes, it's just, again, being informed consumers and knowing that we need sleep. Think again, the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the foundation, sleep is one of them. And in fact, the American Heart Association had 7 essentials for heart health. And the last few years, they added sleep. Now it's 8. And they said, because we have enough research now to know that lack of sleep is an undeniable damaging factor for the heart, the whole cardiovascular system. So we have to make decisions of what we're going to pay a price for and what we're willing to pay a price for versus not. So, okay.
All right. Thank you for your responses there. I think I covered most of the questions. I will open it up to more questions and allow you guys to come off chat once we end the recording. I would like to thank you for attending today's Desert Waters free educational presentation. We invite you to join us again at our next month's webinar on best practices regarding, apologize. It's going to be the Norway model on May 22nd. The time is going to be different. And I'm not good at switching from different time zones, but I believe it is 10:30 Eastern time, 8:30 Mountain time, and you can figure it out from there if I missed your time zone. So with that, if there are any more questions once the recording's over, feel free to come off mute and ask away.